And so she trained to be a nurse in a far-flung little hospital in northern BC that was very, very isolated. And she was very practical too, because she had to know how to, deliver babies and help people die and set broken legs and all of those kinds of things. And I think both of them realized the value of education. And even though I was a female, they thought that my sisters and I should go to college. Many of the farmers thought this was hilarious and a grotesque waste of money. And but they prevailed and worked out.
And Paul?
I was the eldest son of 3 sons, and both my father and my mother, I think, felt that they'd missed out on something, that they hadn't gone to college, and they very much wanted us to go, and we all did pretty well in school, so naturally we did and got caught up in things. We were also fortunate in having lots of good friends in our local high school. It wasn't very big. I think our graduating class was 80 people, but I think 90% of those went on to university, so it was just the thing that you did. I didn't think it was terribly special.
When did you meet? I mean,
we met in a Plato class. A class of about 50.
It's appropriate in one sense, but knowing what you think about.
Yeah, right.
Wrong philosopher, really, for you.
Yeah, it should have been Aristotle.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
I think I was in my second year and you were in your freshman year, or was it?
I think you were in your third and I was in my second year.
I remember seeing this very, very comely lady on the other side of the class, but I don't think I got to know you until well into that year. She had a boyfriend and I had a girlfriend, so we were friends for years before we became sweethearts.
So what was your trajectory from for the first few graduate school and so on? You went to...
I was very lucky. My enthusiasm for physics was genuine, and I kept taking physics and math courses, so that I ended up with the equivalent of a Bachelor of Science degree in physics. But I had decided that I wanted to go on in philosophy, and there was a wonderful graduate program at the University of Pittsburgh, which was famed for having a lot of philosophers of science, and they were delighted to see an application from somebody who had a background in both physics and philosophy. It was an unusual combination then. So they took me in, and that put me into contact not just with a bunch of perfectly wonderful teachers and philosophers, I'll spare you the names. More importantly still, it put me in contact with a whole bunch of perfectly wonderful other graduate students, a large handful of which are 40 years after the fact, very accomplished philosophers. Pat came to Pitt the year following, and
this was 66.
I think so, that's right.
No, that would have... Yes, I beg your pardon, 66.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we all thrived. It was a community of very gifted young men and women, and we profited mightily. Although she ran off to Oxford to get her last degree, for Pittsburgh then was a dirty steel town, and a lady who'd grown up in a sylvan orchard did not find it an agreeable city. So 2 years later I had to go chasing across the Atlantic in order to bring her back.
All right. Well, let's cut to the chase before the chase, which is you went to Oxford for what reason? I mean, and what was the feeling you had when you got there? What was the sense of the philosophy that you were learning there?
Well, it wasn't really a very good reason. That is, from a professional perspective, I should, of course, have stayed at Pittsburgh because it was a perfectly wonderful place, and I had learned a huge amount in the single year that I was there. But I had never traveled, and I had this conception of England that was very romantic, and I really just wanted to travel there and see what it was like. I won a scholarship from the Canadian government to go, and so I was off. And the philosophy there at that time had actually become quite fashionable. It had really grown out of work by the later Wittgenstein, and it focused on language and meaning and conceptual analysis and so forth. And although I didn't really think that there was likely to be very much gold in those hills, I did want to be in England. And I did want to go to the theatre in London and see all these wonderful castles. So it was great being there. And the other thing that was quite wonderful about Oxford was this, that once you were there and you were accepted into the program, they assumed that you weren't impossibly stupid. And so they pretty much let you do what you want. And so I was allowed to sort of, drift around and find what I thought was interesting, which of course turned out to be very much on the fringes of what was mainstream philosophy. And I think they thought it was pretty odd. But I was at Oxford after all, so, it must be more or less okay. And so the great thing about Oxford was I had all of this freedom to do what I wanted to do.
So, but if what was being taught there at that time was not good for you, where did you get the sort of intellectual oxygen that kept you breathing? Good question.
I think that, in fact, it had come from that year I spent at Pittsburgh.
Wow.
And the particular thing that happened there was that we had a seminar with these lively, wonderful graduate students that Paul referred to. We had a seminar on a book by a philosopher called Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine. And Quine was very, very different from the mainstream. And Quine said, look, conceptual analysis, which is what these later Wittgensteinian philosophers do, is really only looking at what people currently mean by certain expressions. But it doesn't tell you anything about whether or not those concepts truly apply to the nature of things. And it also doesn't tell you whether those concepts might be better revised as a result of empirical data, and whether in fact you might even want to ditch those concepts as the empirical data come in. And he said this is true about ideas of knowledge, of what it is to know, and ideas about logic, ideas about decision making, about the whole kit and caboodle. Now, when I describe it that way, it doesn't sound terribly revolutionary, but in actual fact it was. And what it did for me was say, this means then that I'm not just interested in the anthropological question of what somebody means by free will. I'm interested in whether or not we have it. Is it real? Is it in our brains? And that meant that all of a sudden I found myself shifting into the empirical domain to try to understand what we knew, what science knew about the things I was interested in. So Quine for me was the watershed. And of course I tried to argue with people at Oxford and say, but look. And they weren't ready for it at that point. But that didn't matter to me too much because I had great fun doing what I was doing.
Did Quine have an influence on you as well?
Yes, he did. An enormous influence. It happened for me a little bit later than Pat, but Quine is one of the 3 or 4 biggest influences on my life, and for the same reasons that Pat outlines. For him, the philosophical undertaking wasn't something distinct from science. The Oxford philosopher said we do conceptual analysis, and that's at a higher level. It's an a priori undertaking. The scientists engage in factual questions. That's at a different level, and the two solitudes can avoid one another. And Quine's perspective said, No, it's all of a piece. If philosophy is anything, it's just the sloppy, frothy, disorganized cutting edge of research by the human race in general. A really successful philosopher gets dubbed a scientist by history. And if you look back at people like Aristotle and Descartes and Galileo and Newton, these people were all regarded as philosophers or natural philosophers at the time. But they managed to piece together a conceptual framework that was sufficiently organized and sufficiently detailed to make contact with empirical reality that you could then begin to test it, and thus begin